Hello everyone, I'm Rich Foley and welcome to the Blue Rose Copper and Restoration Shop. Today I'm going to make a video of a weather vane. This weather vane is 100% copper. It's all soldered and fastened and assembled. I have the parts made up ahead of time, so I'm going to take it step by step and show you how I build this weather vane. And I made a sketch of this weather vane. It's just a rough drawing. And the weather vane is going to be a fox catching a squirrel. It's mounted on an arrow. This is the arrow. I have this made up. It's over 5 foot long, so this is going to be a big weather vane. The weather vane is mounted on this 1-inch copper stanchion. This is 1 1/4 inch copper pipe, and this whole part in red rotates with the wind. It vanes with the wind. The wind will push on this feather of the arrow and point into the direction of the wind when it's finished. It's a functional weather vane. And it has a northern directioner on it, which is this. It also has a fancy copper ball with these 2 cones on it that'll be soldered onto an 1.5 inch copper pipe. That's the main support for the weather vane. But I changed it a little bit. It's not going to be like this sketch exactly, because I thought this was a little plain. It needed something here. So I made up another piece. It's a copper star, and I put a green patina finish on it. It's on a 3/4 inch copper pipe with a grapevine, full of grapevines and grape leaves. These are all grape leaves. So the fox, which is made from 24-ounce copper, will be mounted on here like this. And the squirrel will be here, like that. And the fox is sneaking around this grapevine to catch that squirrel. Again, everything is 100% copper. Everything will be soldered. When you make something out of copper, you make it to last for 100 years. So everything has to be soldered properly, fastened properly, and you build it so it has a 100-year lifetime. The solder that I'm using is, I'll either be using a bar solder or a wire solder. This is a 1/4 inch wire solder. The flux that I'm using is a paste flux, which is a rosin flux. It's the same flux you use for soldering copper fittings. Or I'll be using a liquid flux, which is it's an acid type of flux that you apply with a paintbrush or an acid swab from a jar. You put a little bit of this in there and you use that for soldering. The torches that I'll be using just a Bird's-O-Matic torch. I'll be using that if I'm soldering the copper pipes together. The other type of torch I'm using is a It's an acetylene torch, which is it's a torch with a soldering copper. It has a heavy copper here, soldering copper, and that's how I apply my heat and control my solder. This is an acetylene soldering torch. Soldering is a very interesting method of joining together pieces of metal with a fusible alloy of tin and lead. That's basically the definition of soldering. Soldering has a fascinating history. It's an old world skill that was developed years ago, and I'll talk about this more as I'm actually doing the process. So, with that being said, let's get started. Okay, I started to assemble the fox and the squirrel onto the arrow. And I fastened it on with copper pop rivets in order to get a good tight fit and for strength of the joint, strength of the soldering joint. It's all put together with copper pop rivets. Now, whenever you're working with copper, you don't use dissimilar metals. You always use something that's compatible with copper, because copper will rot away steel or aluminum or any metal that isn't compatible with copper. And I'm going to solder these flanges that I have for the animals to start with. I've got my arrow held in a little pike vise, which makes it very convenient. It supports it, holds it, and it makes it, I can position it in anywhere I want, just very convenient. And I'm going to apply some flux to these flanges and start my soldering process. Now, as I said before, soldering is a means of joining or uniting together pieces of metal with a fusible alloy. Solder is an alloy. It's a mixture of tin and lead. And solder has a fascinating history. It's an old world skill that dates back to the people who originally invented the process of soldering, which were the Romans. The Roman civilization historically is fascinating. The Roman Empire lasted for thousands of years, and they developed many just incredible inventions. They invented concrete. They made those aqueducts which carried water for thousands of miles. They developed indoor plumbing systems in their houses. And they also invented lead. They were able to make sheet lead. They used lead extensively in their buildings and their living. So in order to join the lead together, they developed the soldering method. So the Romans are credited with inventing solder. And unfortunately, after the fall of the Roman Empire, historically, the world went into the Dark Ages. And a lot of those skills were lost for a long time. And it took thousands of years to develop them back. but they are credited with the invention of soldering. Now, whenever you're soldering, I wear protective eyewear. Now, I have to wear these goggles because I wear glasses, so they're kind of funny looking, but I have to do that. I also usually put something on my hands, just some light gloves. You can use leather gloves if you're concerned with the heat, but this just protects my hands from the flux and the solder. And you should also solder in a well-ventilated area. If you're not soldering under a hood like I don't have a hood here, you would use it in a ventilated room where you can exchange the air with the outside air. I have my doors open, so I've got plenty of ventilation. So the process that I'm going to do is I'm going to use my wire solder and use my iron, and I'm going to start to apply the solder onto this joint. You have to heat the metal first, and the solder will follow the heat. You try to be careful that you don't run the solder all over everything, because it'll make a mess. And if you do, you can clean it up. But what you're doing is you're sweating it in, because this weather vane that I'm making will be here 100 years from now. So you don't want your soldering joints to fail. So I'm applying the heat, applying the solder, applying the flux. Controlling my solder with my heat. Sweating it into the joint so you get a nice, strong joint. Here I'm applying the flux on the next joint. And again, I'm using my iron. The tip of my iron is a soldering copper. I'm using that to control the solder and the heat. You have to reach a temperature of over 400 degrees when you're soft soldering like this. That's what's required. So it's pretty hot. There's those two joints. And I'm going to turn this arrow around. Okay, so here we go. Apply the soldering flux. This is a liquid. It's a liquid flux. It's diluted hydrochloric acid. And it cleans the oxides and the dirt and the chemicals from your soldering job. And it's absolutely necessary. There's a little runoff, which I'll clean later. Again, your soldering copper applies the heat and controls the solder. You have to have that temperature on the metal in order for that copper to flow and to wet onto your piece. There's that one. My last flange on here. There. The fox and the squirrel are soldered to the arrow. And this is my star, made out of copper. I put a green patina finish on that. Now, the way I did that was I applied a chemical patina solution, which I painted on lightly with a brush, and it overnight it turns it a beautiful shade of green. What you're doing is you're accelerating the oxidation process for the copper. Now, if we put this outside and let it set for 20 years, Mother Nature would do the same thing for this, because that's what happens with copper. Now I'm going to solder this 3/4 inch copper pipe into this fitting, and with that I use the rosin flux, which is the same flux that you'd use if you're doing copper plumbing work. And you apply that onto both pieces like so. Might be difficult to see this because there's so many leaves in the way, but I'll do the best I can to show you this. With that, I'm going to use this propane torch to apply my heat. Here we go. Got to readjust here. I bumped it. You'll actually be able to see the solder flow down into the joint. That section is done. Now I'm going to solder the bottom piece onto this weather vane, which is this piece. So that's phase 3. Well, we're back to soldering on the last part of this upper section of the weather vane. And this is a piece of 1-inch copper, and this actually goes right to this section of the weather vane. This is actually the piece that spins. I'm going to apply my flux first. And I'm going to square this up a little bit. And then with my torch, I'm going to solder. And I could see that solder flow into the joint, so it's totally sweat soldered. Next phase, I'm going to start on this lower section, which is attaching this ball and this arrow. I finished up the top section of this weather vane. I tweaked it, made some adjustments. I made sure that my pipes were plumb and square. And I installed these 2 gussets onto this upper arrow arm. And those are just support gussets to support that very wide 5-foot arm. This is done now. This is ready to be installed. This is the top section. Then I went ahead and I finished up this ball with the cones on it. I soldered it onto the main 1.5-inch stem, and also I installed the directional arm. So this lower section is pretty much finished. Again, I soldered this decorative ball and the cones onto the piece of 1.5 inch. I installed the directional arm. I made an 1.5 by 3/16 inch bus bar. I forged it in a round, and I made a bushing to support this clamp for the north directional. There's an 1.5 inch copper washer here that the top section of this weather vane spins on. The top section slips right over the top of this, and it spins on this. This is 3/4 inch copper with these copper fittings. So this weather vane is ready to be assembled. I'm going to take it outside, and I'm going to assemble it outside in front of my shop. I'm setting the weather vane up outside in front of my shop. It's a little over 10 foot tall, and it's too big to put together inside, so I'm going to put it together outside. That's what the finished weather vane looks like. It's big. 5 foot wide, 10 foot tall. It spins in the wind. Telling you the direction of the wind. This is a big weather vane. If you put this on a big horse barn or a steeple or a big tall barn, once you get it up in the air, it doesn't look that big. You have to build it a big scale when you're putting it on a big building. Otherwise, they look tiny up there. So this is a finished weather vane. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'm Rich Foley. This is the Blue Rose Copper and Restoration Shop, and I hope to see you again.